Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to see this room full of people for a very special occasion, the inaugural Dr. Brian Trainor Memorial Lecture. And thank you very much for coming and supporting it today. I worked and I knew Dr. Trainor for over 20 years. I considered him a close personal friend. We worked together in many projects. We travelled across America, from Connecticut to Texas and beyond. And it's my great pleasure to be able to speak to you on this occasion. It's been made possible by the generosity of many people, and I express my thanks to you and those who supported this initiative. Thanks to the family, thanks to the Causeway Coast and Glens Family Society, and thanks to everyone else who generously gave to make this occasion possible. Dr. Trainor was a huge figure in archives for more than half a century. He was a man of tremendous knowledge, tremendous generosity, and a tremendous belief in making archives accessible to all. It's my great honour to introduce our guest lecturer today. Professor Cormac Ó Gráda is now retired but was for many years in the Department of Economics at UCD. He has made a huge contribution to the study of economic history of Ireland, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's made a huge contribution to the study of famines in Ireland and worldwide. And recently, he's been carrying out extensive research into 18th century English economic history. He knew Dr. Trainor for more than 40 years, going back into the 70s when he was coming to the old PRONI in Balmoral Avenue to conduct his research. Cormac, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. We're very grateful to you for agreeing to speak on this occasion, and delighted now to hand over to you for the inaugural lecture. Thank you.
Well, thanks, William. This is truly a great honour. I would echo what's just been said about Brian, and I would add that he was passionate about history. He was passionate about Ulster history in particular from very early on. As a public servant, he was passionate about serving the public. And he made this place and Balmoral Avenue a haven and a happy hunting ground for both professional and amateur researchers from far and near. Brian was a visionary. There was something entrepreneurial about him. He was a doer. And I think it's thanks to him and to his colleagues and successors that PRONI, as a custodian of both public and a wide range of private records, has had a much broader and ambitious remit than either the UK Public Office in London or indeed the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin. And PRONI also has been more active to begin with in its publishing activities and for a long time now in its outreach activities. And I think Brian also played a huge part in making the Ulster Historical Foundation the great resource that it is for those researching, in particular, family history. Brian personally helped many scholars in many different ways, and since I'm going to be talking about migration, I should note his long-standing interest in emigrant letters as a historical source, and how scholars as far apart as Rodney Green in Belfast, Patrick O'Farrell in Sydney, Ruth Ann Harris in Boston, Kirby Miller in Missouri, and Robin Haynes in Adelaide have all fulsomely acknowledged his support. Brian also had a long-standing interest in emigrant passenger lists, and very early on in my own career, this is in the 70s, he got me interested in passenger lists, and indeed passed on some he had transcribed himself to me. And one of my very early publications was based on an analysis of those lists. They also inspired a piece of work I did with the American economic historian Joel Mokyr, in which we used age heaping in the passenger lists and in the census as a way of testing whether pre-famine emigration led to what is sometimes called a brain drain. So Brian helped and influenced my own career at the start, and towards the end of a long and fruitful life, he passed on to me a lot of 19th century probate data that he had been transcribing and collecting himself in the National Archives in Dublin. I haven't delivered yet on my promise to produce a piece of work based on those data, but I promise to do that. Brian's surname, by the way, is fitting. In Irish, Trainor means a powerful and impressive man. But Brian was also a gentleman, and I will try and give a talk that reflects his constant commitment to a broad and inclusive approach to everything he did. As an archivist and a researcher, Brian advised those interested in family history, here I'm quoting him, to use the full range of documentary resources available. Now, this lecture falls somewhat short on that score because I'm going to focus on research that relies mostly on one kind of source, and that is digitized databases. I mean by this mainly censuses, but not only censuses. Now, such data are being used nowadays to shed light on questions that were not easily answered or indeed answerable a few decades ago. Much of this research has been directed at an academic audience, but should be, I think, more widely known beyond the confines of the specialist literature in which most of it is to be found. Much of it also has been directed at readerships outside of Ireland, but deserves to be better known at home. So I will move chronologically, focusing on some work. Some of it is already out there, some of it is already in process, on emigration during and at the wake of the Great Famine, and then on emigration, and a little bit too on return migration during the age of mass migration before World War I. So, to begin with, it was Marion Casey of Ireland House in New York University who introduced me in 1995, I think it was, to the archive of the Emigrant Savings Bank in New York, which she played a major part in rescuing. The early history of the bank has been written up by different people since, and it can be summarized very quickly. In 1850, a group of successful expat Irish men, they were all men, living in New York, founded at the behest of Tyrone-born Bishop John Hughes, the Emigrant Industrial Savings Bank. The idea was to found a bank that would provide the poor with a means of bettering themselves and acquiring the habit of saving. At the time, such banks were a vehicle for middle-class philanthropy. There were lots of them being set up in Britain, and indeed there were several other savings banks already in existence in New York when the Emigrant started business. But the bank anyway proved a great success, and it's one of the few, maybe it's the only one of these savings banks that were set up in the first half of the 19th century that still survives in New York. By the end of the 1850s, and that's the period I'll be considered with, it had attracted nearly 20,000 depositors. Now, the archive is a particularly rich source in its coverage for that decade. After that decade, the quality falls off, and a lot of the material, in fact most of it, has been lost. But for that golden decade between 1850 and 1858, we have details on every account holder's transactions, name, address, occupation, where they were born, and that's down to parish level, and in the case of, there were lots of non-Irish account holders as well, what state and what current day Germany they lived in, date of arrival in the US if they were immigrants, the ship on which they arrived, the names and whereabouts of parents and siblings, these are all given. Marion Casey did not exaggerate when writing of its registers. She argued, and I'm quoting her, collectively these volumes rank with the richest sources to be found on either side of the Atlantic for the study of Irish emigration. Now, my own early researches on this source focused on the saving habits of the depositors, and also their reaction to two crises, to two panics during the 1850s, in 1854 and 1857. So what I did was to compare the minority who closed their accounts during those panics with the majority who didn't, and look for characteristics that differentiated them. And that is a question which is of considerable interest to monetary and banking historians. And it addresses, if you like, the question, who panics during panics? What kind of people are more prone to run on a bank if there's a run? So with some co-authors, I published papers almost 2 decades ago, and we found that, I'm not going to go into that work now, that the answer depended on the nature of the panic, whether it was well-founded or not, and also that networks mattered a lot. So you were more likely to panic if somebody else you knew panicked or was from the same area in Ireland as you. These things matter. Controlling for everything else. Now, my work on the emigrant was based on samples, but recently an American historian called Tyler Anbinder has put together the whole database for that period. Everything is in the database. He's a historian of New York. He's published several works on various aspects of New York history, and his ultimate ambition is to write a book about the Emigrant Savings Bank and mainly its Irish account holders. But in the meantime, he's created this database, and an economic historian in New York, Simon Weggy, and I have got together with him, and we've done some work and have published a few papers, and there's another paper in train, and it's that paper that is about to be published before the year is out that I want to talk about now. But like, this illustrates the kind of detail you get. You find out that the first ever depositor in the bank was one Bridget White, who was born in Laois, or what was then Queen's County. Her maiden name was Flanagan. She deposited $100. She had arrived in New York 9 years previously. Bridget is described as a housekeeper living at 45 Henry Street in the 7th Ward in Lower Manhattan. We read that her father was still alive in Ireland, but her mother had died, and she had 3 brothers living in the US and 1 in Ireland. Her sisters' whereabouts are not given, but their names are. So you can see how rich the potential here is. In the meantime, she had married one William White, who was an American, and the second account opened in the Emigrant is his account, also for $100. Now, that was a sizable sum of money at the time. It probably was worth something like 3 months' labourers' wages. Bridget and William closed their accounts 6 years later, both withdrawing identical sums of $441.28. So they must have, acted in tandem, withdrawing and depositing together, or on behalf of each other. But we can find them, at least Tyler found them, in the US Census in 1870, by which time they had moved to Illinois and were living a comfortable existence as tailors. Comfortable, judging by the value of their personal and real estate. The last account holder in our database was also an Irish woman who deposited the princely sum of $500 on the 2nd of October 1858. Now, as it happens, those 2 female depositors were atypical in terms of first deposits, and also in having arrived in New York before the famine. So what we have done then is try and come up with, if you like, an identikit image of what the average savers were like. So Simon Veggie, Tyler Anbrinder and myself have been using the database, the linked database, to try and get a sense of how the Irish adapted in New York and beyond in the period before the Civil War. Tyler has also produced a fascinating website. You can find this online. If you Google "Beyond Rags to Riches," you have access to the database I'm going to talk about, and to a lot of related material. Now, one of the key messages of the EISB data is the importance of networks and niches. I will mention a few networks with roots in Ulster. The first consisted of immigrants from the neighbouring parishes of Kiltar, Killybegs Upper and Killactee in southwest Donegal. There's a cluster of people from that area with accounts in the bank. These immigrants specialised in a single trade, peddling. In fact, 1/5 of all male Irish peddlers with accounts in the Emigrant in the 1850s came from those three parishes. A second group of Donegal immigrants living primarily in the Fourth Ward concentrated on leather production. These so-called Morocco dressers, who cured goat hides for use in cheap leather for bookbinding, upholstery and shoes, emigrated primarily from Dunamore and Stranorlar, two contiguous parishes in East Donegal. A third group consisted of Tyrone emigrants earning a living in the charcoal trade. Of the emigrant bank depositors whose Irish origins are known and who worked in New York's charcoal business in any capacity, from charcoal merchant down to charcoal wagon driver, 96% were from County Tyrone. Archbishop Hughes's own county, of course. 2/3 of these workers were from one of Tyrone's 42 parishes, civil parishes, Bodoni Lower, which I guess today would be more familiar as Gorton. My final example relates to male immigrant account holders from Castle Gregory in West Kerry, more than half of whom worked in Manhattan as gasmen in the 1850s, living near or working in the enormous New York City gasworks. This was dirty, dangerous and unhealthy work, but that did not deter the Castle Gregory men. So Anne Binder's close analysis of the data suggests that these networks played an important role in determining who came to the United States, and you can see some sense of this. This gives you a sense of where people who arrived before the famine were from by civil parish, and then people who arrived from the summer of 1846 on. And you can see, while there's an opening up in Munster, the areas that mattered a lot in North Leinster and in West Ulster are also very prominent after the famine. So there is persistence, there's continuity, and there is a sense in which one might argue that this pattern here made it easier for people to move during the famine. So when things got really rough, the people who had already arrived could send money home or could provide accommodation for people from the home parish when they arrived. So that is, again, a form of networking or chain migration. So we see a striking persistence in spatial emigration patterns, and it suggests that those who went before, to some extent, paved the way for those who followed. Parishes with a record of pre-famine immigration sent 3 times as many post-famine account holders as those with no pre-famine account holders. Among those, I spent a little bit of time talking about one particular group. Among those who opened accounts in the bank in the 1850s were about 250 savers from the contiguous civil parishes of Kenmare, Tuathist and Kilcascan. These are in Kerry in the southwest of the island. All of them had arrived in New York in 1851 or 1852 as paupers, as people who had been assisted by their landlord and also by the local workhouse in Kenmare to make the journey across the Atlantic. Most of them were, according to the local land agent, William Stewart Trench, absolute and entire paupers and on the very verge of entering the Union workhouse when they left, if they weren't already in the workhouse. Now, these people nearly all settled in the biggest slum, the most notorious slum in New York, in the so-called 5 Points in the 6th Ward. This was, for people like Charles Dickens, a kind of no-go area. You enter the 5 Points area at your peril. But the Lansdowners, as I'll call them, after their landlord, they settled almost exclusively in this ward, and they stayed there for the most part during the period I'm going to talk about. Now, those who arrived, and again this is Tyler's story, included one Cornelius, or Con O'Sullivan, from Tuathist, who arrived in March 1851 with his wife Norrie and 4 children aged between 7 and 17. On landing, the Sullivans got shelter in the charity boarding house run by the New York Emigrant Commissioners. Some weeks later, Cornelius and Daniel were still living there, or had returned there, while his wife and 3 eldest children were living at the city almshouse on Ward's Island. Then young Norrie, who was aged 10, one of the kids, died, and soon Cornelius moved the rest of the family out of the almshouse into a dilapidated tenement, a flat on Little Water Street, one of the seediest blocks in the 5 Points. Now this is not Water Street, but it's a similar street. This here is 31 Baxter Street, and we have account holders who lived in this very house in the 1850s. But anyway, the thing about this Sullivan guy is that he does something surprising. He opens an account in the Emigrant Savings Bank with $5. And that is when he divulged all this information about the kids and when they arrived and where they lived and so on. Life was not easy. Within 3 months, he had closed the account again. But a year later, he opened another with $136, which is about 6 months' wages for an unskilled worker. So the frugality and the hard work involved can only be imagined. For years, the balance in the Sullivan account rose and fell. By 1859, when Sullivan was making a living as a peddler, the account held $238. By September 1862, it reached $600, and by January 1865, it peaked at nearly $1,200. Not bad going, even allowing for wartime inflation. In sum, what the Sullivans had deposited by the end of the Civil War would have bought a sizable farm or a mansion, a decent house in New York. Now, Tyler sees this as a kind of a cameo that tells about how the Irish could succeed in New York, starting from nothing. And, you know, in the case of Sullivan, if it's not rags to riches, it's from rags to comfort at least. For most of the people who settled in the 6th Ward from Kenmare, it wasn't like that. They're still there 10 years later. For the most part, they have work as unskilled labourers, and they're still involved in that kind of work when we lose track of them in the census. We can follow a lot of them through, but for the most part, some succeed. And when I say succeed, they move from being unskilled workers to being traders of some sort. People selling fruit, people peddling, that kind of thing. Very few move from blue collar to white collar, and that's not surprising because most of these people would have been illiterate, and a lot of them would have been monoglot Irish speakers. And again, we can see that only a minority can sign their names when this is one of the things you were asked to do when you joined the bank, and only a small minority of the Lansdowners could do so. But still they were keen to join the Emigrant Savings Bank. And on Baxter Street here, which is just north of the 5 Points intersection, where the Lansdowners dominated, nearly 3/5 of the Lansdowne families had Emigrant Bank savings accounts. So it wasn't just a small minority. This was something that was common among these very poor people. Now, the problem, I just want to make a general point about this. These people were in New York not because they could afford to get there. They were helped to get there. And like I say, they didn't strike it rich, but they survived. And I would see this as, you know, evidence for a policy that was not enacted during the famine. A lot of people made the point during the famine that once the potato failed, there was no going back to the status quo ante. Ireland could never again, or in the foreseeable future, hold 8.5 million people. So what's going to happen to them? Well, they're on welfare for years and years and years. They die, or you help them leave. And this is a statement very early on by a Galway landlord, but that kind of statement was fairly commonplace. But the government, for its own reasons, decided that it was not going to help people leave. And what that meant is that those who could afford left. But the poorest of the poor, like these Lansdowne people, like they were still there in 1850. They weren't able to go at the height of the famine. And there were lots more like them who weren't able to go, and of course who ended up dying. So the main problem with the Lansdowne emigration is that it began so late when the famine was virtually over. Now, so the Lansdowne story is in part about immigrant adaptation. There's another piece of work, a recent piece of work, which I think it's just been published, or else it's on so-called Early View. It's by 2 American authors, one Irish-American, one Israeli-American. And it is an analysis, again, using census data, US census data, of Irish immigrants, famine immigrants, and people who left before the famine. And it compares the Irish to immigrants from Germany and from Britain. Now, how do they distinguish famine immigrants from pre-famine immigrants? They look at the ages and the place of birth of co-resident children. So, you know, if you move over and your children have been born in Ireland, that says something different than if you move over and your children have been born in America in, say, 1843. And so they can distinguish. And so this is what they find. Since I'm short of time, I put up bullet points, and they find that these people face long odds, but that on the whole they did quite well. And they end with this note here. They see they're economists. They're economic historians, but with, you know, that they would be more economists than historians. But they would see this as a contribution to the economics of migration in cases of natural and man-made disasters. And you can read the rest for yourselves. But their point is that in this situation, the famine, emigration acted as a form of disaster relief. Without this outlet, things would have been much worse in Ireland. Just the same as if there hadn't been nearly 500,000 emigrating to the UK, to the mainland, if you like, during the 1840s, things would have been much worse in Ireland. So During the age of mass migration, we're talking, if you like, about open borders, so it's a very specific period. Now, the marriage and fertility of the Irish have also been studied using the same kind of digitized census source. And I'm referring to here to work that's been done, that's been out there for a while, involving Tim Gunnan and co-authors. And Foley and Gunnan, they're interested in the impact of Americanization on whether the Irish married or not, the age at which they married, and so on. And they argue that there was Americanization going on, that people who emigrated to America, men, were much more likely to marry than those who stayed behind in the late 19th century. And then there is this work by Gunnan, and I'm involved in that too, on marital fertility. And what they show is that while the Irish maintained very high marital fertility by US standards, the fertility of the Irish in America was less than the fertility of those they left behind. So there is some acculturation involved as well in that case. Now, let me move on to another issue, which is something that when I mentioned at the beginning that I did some work early on with Joel Mokier, like we did a bit of work, and I don't think it was, it's easy to, 30 years later, I don't think it was fully convincing. But what we were trying to see whether there was selection, or whether, if you like, the best and the brightest were those who left, and that those who stayed behind were in some sense less healthy, less educated, less talented, more risk averse. That is a big issue in the economics of migration. Well, I thought I should mention here a paper by a young, well, I call him an economic historian. He probably at work would call himself a geographer or a historical geographer, Dylan Connor. So I guess these are the kind of people he's looking at. The idea that emigration robbed Ireland of its best and brightest is a pervasive and persistent one. And I suppose the presumption is perhaps strongest for the pre-famine era, when the high cost of transatlantic passage made it impossible, like I said, for the poorest to leave. And indeed, it would seem that in the pre-famine decades, those from the poorest low-wage counties were least likely to leave. So, in a sense, those who needed most to go were least in a position to go. And you could even maybe stretch that argument and claim that emigration may have exacerbated regional inequalities within Ireland in the pre-famine period. But direct comparisons between those who left and those who stayed are elusive. Now, Dylan Connor is interested in this issue, but he addresses it for the early part of the last century. And what he compares is people in 1901 and in 1911 in the Irish census, and where you can find them, the same people in the US Census of 1910. So you have three groups of people: those who stay put, those who move elsewhere within Ireland, and those who move to the US. So people who move to Britain, Canada, or Australia, wherever, they're not part of the equation here. But Connor is interested mainly in comparing those who left and those who stayed. And I'm making this sound easier than it is. You're never sure you've got the right person. So there is this issue of missing people, but there's also the problem of what is known in the literature as false positives. There's a John Ryan, and you find a John Ryan, you say, oh, bingo, and it's not bingo, and you end up making false inferences. That's tricky. So he is very careful about how he links, and he's conservative. So I think we can trust his work. But his argument, just in summary, is that migrants were negatively selected. They're drawn from households headed by farmers and by less literate men in low productivity agricultural communities. Okay? So it's not like what I described in the pre-famine situation. People are leaving poor areas, and in those poor areas they're leaving small farms, and they're more likely to come from households where the head of household is illiterate and so on. So he argues against the notion of brain drain or the bone and the sinew being lost due to emigration. Now, one thing which he can't deal with, and which I think is nevertheless relevant, is within the same household, parents decide who goes. And there's probably positive selection within the negative selection, if you like. In other words, you have a household in Leitrim. They're very poor, and the parents are deciding who should go. They're not going to send somebody who's sickly. They're not going to send somebody who can't be trusted to make do on their own. So there probably is some positive selection at the household level, but then at the broader macro level, we're talking about negative selection, if I've made that clear. And that's not a criticism, that is something that Dylan Connor, obviously with the data, you can't address sibling and sibling. But anyway, so this is a great piece of work. If you Google Dylan Connor, you'll find the paper online, and if there's a paywall, you can find a discussion paper version of it. You know, the same is true of all the work by Gonan, by Anbinder, and so on. It's all out there if you're interested in it. Now, I want to talk next about another aspect, and this is about emigration, but it's about return. It's about the issue, a lot of people left, can we say anything about those who came back? And here I'm talking about joint work with somebody I'm very proud to call my ex-student, Alan Fernier, who's here. I won't point, very shy guy, but he's here in the room. So the custom of the so-called American wake hints at the permanent character of most long-distance Irish emigration. And famously, for the Irish, as with the Jews, emigration to the New World was more likely to be permanent than for practically any other European group. And the point is that they had perhaps less to return to. And you can see that in Ireland today. You have, say in Dublin, you have lots of people from Nigeria and lots of people from Poland. Who are most likely to return home? The Poles. And there's a lot of toing and froing. But the gap, even when things get really bad in Ireland, the Nigerians will be inclined to say, well, they're that much worse at home, we're going to hang in and stay. And you could make the same kind of point about among migrants to North America from Europe, the Irish were among the poorest for a long time. But at the same time, it's true that towards the end of the 19th century, more people returned than immediately after the famine. And of course, that is, you know, there's evidence of all this story about, they were first called Return Yankees, and then that got abbreviated to Return Yanks. And the Return Yank is part of Irish literary fiction. A century ago, plays in which the returned Yank was a character were performed in parish halls all over Ireland. They haven't survived because I don't think they were very good plays, but the point is that the returned Yank was somebody who stood out. And the returned Yank was in part, I suppose, the focus of envy, but they were also feared by certain parties because there was the worry that they would entice others to leave. You know, these people come back and they have a swagger about them, they seem to have money to spend, so others are lured away as a result. Now, there is a bit of a literature about return migration to Ireland, but it's mostly about the recent past. and most of it is by social scientists, by economists and sociologists, rather than by historians. But there is some work, and notably there's a book that is a classic, and that appeared 60 years ago, a book by Arnold Schreer, which is about mainly Irish emigration, but there is a whole chapter devoted to return migration. And one of the things Schreer included in that book is his analysis of a questionnaire he had the Irish Folklore Commission circulate on his behalf. So he was a pretty, resourceful guy. He was a grad student. He approached them in his early 20s and he said, would you do this for me? And lo and behold, they sent a questionnaire formulated by him to their list of collectors throughout the country. And the trouble with that evidence, which is available online now, is that it's a bit all over the place. It's impressionistic, and you might be inclined to say that A contradicts B, U contradicts C. I think if you handle the material carefully, that the impression is that most people who came back were successes rather than failures. But there's probably somebody who analyzes the data and who would come up with a different conclusion. That's how I would distill the evidence. Now, as well as that, there is work by David Fitzpatrick, the late David Fitzpatrick. He has a book due out soon called The Americanization of Ireland, and some of that book is about return migration. And his focus is, in some of that work, on County Leitrim. And he chose Leitrim for a variety of reasons. One is it was small enough to be manageable. Another is that maybe his own paternal ancestors came from South Leitrim. And then there is the point that if you look at the 1901 and 1911 census, Leitrim contains more returned Americans as a proportion of population than any other Irish county. So it seems like maybe a good one to choose. And the way David worked is a lot like the way Collins and Zimran did in trying to differentiate famine-era immigrants from pre-famine-era immigrants. David Fitzpatrick looks at these American-born people, and if their parents are Irish-born, then that suggests that they're return immigrants. Okay, so he builds up a database of return immigrants to Leitrim and figures out the average age, what they did in Leitrim, and so on. So what Alan Fernier and I have done is to do this not just for one county, but to do it for the island as a whole. So you have more data, and arguably it's going to be more representative. Now, some of what we find is like what David Fitzpatrick found, but some of it is a bit different. For instance, he found that virtually everybody who returned was a farmer, or a small farmer. We find that the profile of occupations is different. We also find some other things here. We find that people were more likely to return to richer counties in Ireland. And that, in terms of the economics of migration and the economic consequences of migration, that is something to be, I suppose, happy about. You know, you don't want people leaving poor areas and then being more likely to come back to those same poor areas, because if that's happening, then emigration is not fulfilling its role of raising living standards and making things better both at home and abroad. But we find that actually, even though return migrants in Leitrim were very high as a proportion of population, as a proportion of those who left, they were not. And that is the ratio that we think is more important. I'll show you a table that bears on that in a minute. We also find that these people are not to be seen as losers, the return migrants for the most part. They are people who went, who accumulated some money, and for whatever reason wanted to come home. So it's not that they came home, some of course, we're talking about averages. Some came home because they didn't like it out there and they weren't successful. That's true of my own grandfather. He spent a year in Butte, Montana, and mining did not agree with him, and his lungs were giving out, so he returned home. But some of his siblings stayed, and I still have distant cousins in Butte, Montana. The returnees were more skilled than the Irish population, as those who did not. And then we can also show that they had lower fertility and a lower infant and child mortality. And these are positives. Higher literacy. So, there we are. So, what you need to compare here is the numbers in the columns. So what you see here is that this is the important one. Returnees as a ratio of emigrants, and this is per 10,000. So, but you see that the poorest provinces, Munster and Connacht, have the lowest ratios, whereas here they have high ratios. And that is because in the period between 1880 and 1911, emigration from the poor areas is very high. So if you take emigration as a proportion of population, you're going to get a big number. But in terms of the economics and the welfare of economics and migration, I think it's this column rather than that one should be looking at. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to have to rush through this, I'm afraid, it's not about emigration so much as immigration. I mean, the island of Ireland now has become a place of immigration. So I think it's interesting to think back to a time when immigration was a tiny phenomenon. Again, we're using digitized sources, and I began working in this area with the Jewish community in Ireland in 1901 and 1911. And the point is, the data were, as people describe it now, hand collected. You could do this for the Jewish community because you knew where they lived. They all lived close to each other. And there was in Dublin, and indeed in Belfast, a Jewish neighbourhood. So you'd go to the streets where you knew. And you'd find them, in the case of Dublin, you could just go through street directories. And then you find these people in the census, you build up a database, and you can make various generalizations about their occupations, their literacy, their health. And that's what I did. I wrote a book about that. But you could not do that with other immigrant communities because it would be a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack before digitization. But once you have all the data, once you have the whole census as a database, then you can look at the column which has place of birth, and you can simply take out whatever group you're interested in. And again, I'm thankful to Alan for providing me with the data on the tiny number of Italians who had settled in Ireland before World War I. And I want to talk a little bit about them. Now, in one sense, you might say they're like the Jews in that there aren't very many of them, and they both had a kind of a myth, or they do today, that they descended from a particular part. So for the Jewish community, it was the village of Akmane, what's called Akmane today, but in Yiddish was known as Akmayan. So the descendants of the Jews who came to Ireland, mainly from Lithuania, so they were Litvaks, they all think, oh, our people came from Akmane. And strictly speaking, this is not true, but they came from that region. In the same way, Italians in Ireland today, this is true now, north and south, think their descendants, or their ancestors came from a place called Casalatico. And there's a fine book that was produced by a student in UCD with that title, Casalatico, in the 1990s. But in the case of the Italians, actually, in 1911, the truth is much more complicated, as it is in the case of the Jews. It's also true, they had another thing in common in Dublin. When the earliest Jews arrived in Dublin, the DMP, the police, found them a place to stay on a street called Chancery Lane, which was very run down at the time. And they left pretty soon, and they moved somewhat further south, if you know your Dublin, towards the South Circular Road, Clanbrassil Street, Lower Clanbrassil Street, and so on. The Italians also settled in Chancery Lane, but they are inclined to stay there, and more of them stay. So the Jewish immigrants were more upwardly mobile than the Italians in this early phase. Now, one of the interesting things about the Italians is that Belfast contained more of them than Dublin, whereas with the Jewish community it was the other way around. Dublin always had far more Jews than Belfast. And I think you can explain that by noting that the Jews at the outset concentrated on peddling, on selling goods on credit through their so-called weekly system, and to some extent on money lending. So these are occupations which cater to the poor, people who are not so well off. Whereas the Italians specialised successively in organ grinding, making and selling ice cream and confectionery, and of course then obviously fish and chips. Joseph Chervy, who is usually credited with setting up the first fish and chips outlet in Dublin, had also operated as an ice cream seller and as an organ grinder. And a friend of mine gave me this postcard. This is on. This is now Pier Street, and this is where Joseph Chervy set up. In fact, we can read that in April 1907, one Kathleen Murray brought damages, a case against Chervy for food poisoning, but the judge dismissed the case on the grounds that the mackerel she had consumed some hours before Chervy's ice cream was more likely to have been the cause of her distress. And similarly, the Rabaiotti family switched from being ice cream vendors on Amiens Street in 1901 to being fish and chip people on Wexford Street in 1911. The names and ages of their co-resident servants in 1901 and 1911 suggest considerable staff turnover in the interim. But in both cases, they consisted mainly of young men from northern Italy, particularly Lombardy and Emilia-Romagna. How do I know that? Because surnames in Italy are like they are in Ireland. They're a very good predictor of where in Italy you're from. In Belfast, most of the Italians were from the Casalatico region, the people who were there before World War I. Whereas in Dublin it was different. Most of Dublin's Italians at that stage were from Tuscany and Lombardy. And they were probably a bit better off. They tended to be skilled workers, like making picture frames. They were stucco workers, and so on. So this is not one community. You could say that the Jewish community, the immigrant, is one community, but these people, the Belfast and the Dublin Italian expats, were from, broadly speaking, this is a generalisation, different parts of Italy. In 1911, Ireland had 12 Italian-born organ grinders, or street musicians. 5 of these were from Casalatico and 7 from elsewhere. And this is an emblematic employment for Italian immigrants. And I could tell you some stories about it if I had time, because again they crop up in the newspapers. I'll just mention one because it concerns somebody quite famous. This is a story about two organ grinders from Castlatico who were charged in 1904 with annoying the well-known writer George Moore of the Literary Revival by playing loudly outside his house in upmarket Ely Place. And you wonder, why were they playing this? It's not where you would set up, you know, it's not Grafton Street, but that's where they were. And it goes, and refusing to desist when asked to do so. So Moore complained that the noise was intolerable, but one of the buskers protested that he left when he had finished the tune and promised not to play outside Moore's house anymore. But they had to post a bond, as it were, and to desist from what was described as a deliberate persecution, which is stretching language, I suppose. Now, in 1911, the occupational profile of the Castlelaticans differed markedly from the majority of non-Castlelaticans. Of the quarter with occupations who had Castlelatican surnames, and these are ones you're familiar with: Fusciardi, Macari, Cafola, Forte, Malacca, and so on, 26 were ice cream vendors, and the other 21 were confectioners or shopkeepers. Only one or two of the Castlelaticans at this point were fish and chip merchants, and they would include Chervy. The Castlelaticans were less likely to be labourers, but they were also less likely to be white-collar or skilled workers. Stephen Daedalus' claim that Jews were of all races most given to intermarriage was based on Joyce's interactions with the urbane and well-integrated Jewish community of Trieste, which was then part of the Habsburg Empire. And in a way, Leopold Bloom, whom we all know and love, is not a Dublin Jew, he's a Triestine Jew. His attitudes, his prejudices, his modernity, if you like, doesn't come from the Dublin Jewish community, which was extremely pious and very inward-looking. It comes from Trieste. And that remark about the Jews being most given to intermarriage certainly did not apply to Ireland's immigrant Jews. And in that respect, the Italians were different. 7 of the 8 Italian male households heads living in Chancery Lane in 1901 had married Irish women. Moreover, they had married women who were younger than them by an average of 10 years or so. And in all cases but one, it was a case of Italian men who could neither read nor write marrying literate Irish women. So you get the sense, in some sense, they're marrying up, you know. They're marrying women who are more educated than them and who are younger than them. And you're left asking, if these older illiterate Italians were considered good catches, what does it say about Irishmen? The census data suggests that a century ago, the habit of marrying out seems to have been prevalent among Dublin's Italian immigrants, whereas in Belfast, marrying within a more tightly knit, mainly Cassalese community was the norm. Reynolds, writing in the early 1990s, he is the guy who wrote this book called Castlelatico, highlights how Cassalese households in Ireland, and this is in modern Ireland, maintained their traditions, noting that, and I quote him, the second generation, that is, those who were born in Ireland, usually speak dialect to their children. And I'm nearly through. Many of the Italian men recorded in 1911 had married out, including 6 of the 7 based in Cork. And a few even changed religion while doing so. The 1911 census records 3 cases of Italian men based in Belfast who had changed religion. That is, who had converted from Catholicism in order to marry Protestant women. And that of mosaic worker Rego Trovone, who had married a Presbyterian but remained Catholic. Now, a century ago, these 2 small immigrant communities combined numbered no more than 5,000 or 6,000. By the end of the century, the number of non-Irish born had risen, as had their proportion of the total population. But you see, in 201, 202, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. The proportion of the population born outside two islands is still fairly small, 4% and 2%. 10 years later, in the Republic, it's up to 11%. I don't know what the number is for Northern Ireland yet in 2016. I'm not sure it's been released. No, there wasn't a census in 2016. That's why we don't have that. But you see, so these numbers, they tell a story about a different Ireland. In a sense, they are a marker of Irish economic success. And of course, they also are a pointer to challenges of adaptation and welcome and so on. So to conclude, we have come a long way from when Brian Trainor began his researches into emigration, when the sources had yet to be discovered and when working them was extremely labour intensive. One of the messages of what I have had to say is how far we have come thanks to the IT revolution. Today, those who are interested in some of the things Brian was interested in, such as family history and emigration, have only to insert a name in some search engine or database, and with any luck, they're on the road to discovery. Not only that, but there are digitized sources available to put flesh on the bones, like those little stories I told about the Italians. At the same time, data are not everything. We risk losing much if we do not read the sources. Without them, we lose the nuances and the depth and the colour of context and society. And I think few would have understood that better than Brian. Thanks a lot.